Welcome to The Power of One. My name is Brian Berry, and I'm the host of the show. This program is one that demonstrates how one person can make a difference. Today, we're very fortunate to have Bill Gould V in the studio with us, and we're going to learn a little bit about his story as well as his family's story. So thank you, Bill, very much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. First of all, I wanted to start off to learn a little bit about your history, your personal history and your past. So how was it that you ended up in Altadena community?
Well, yes, I was born kind of on the East Coast, moved around a lot of different places, was born in DC, moved to New York City, moved to Detroit for 3 years, moved to Boston, came to California, but I arrived here in this area when I was going to college. And so I came down here to go to Occidental in the early 80s and was sort of a youngster, 17-year-old kid coming down to go to college, and started there playing some baseball. And as I got into the college life a little bit more, I think I became very active while I was there, became kind of a social justice advocate.
And why Oxy? Why there? You probably had your pick of schools. Why did you pick Occidental?
Well, it appealed to me living in the sort of, Los Angeles County area, and, in a big city. I immediately sort of took to Pasadena. I really enjoyed the environment. I think it's a small school with, I think the average classes are 12 to 1, something like that. So you get a lot of attention. Sometimes that's a great thing, sometimes not so great. But I enjoyed my experience overall there.
Yeah. And I know that social justice and advocacy are very, very important to you. Could you tell me a story about, I think at Oxy, how you got started in thinking about racial justice, social justice, and some of the activities you were engaged in?
Sure. Well, when I was young, I had a sort of a life-altering experience where I lost my arm when I was 6 years old. And I think, that instilled in me I had this very traumatic experience in my life and had a lot of people who helped me. So when I got to Oxy, somehow or another, I had a friend that was working at a group home here in Pasadena. So I started working in child welfare. And so, I was really taken to a lot of the youth that I was meeting in that group home. And ultimately, there was one young woman, after she got out of care, she got married in my backyard, later in life, but there was, and she transcribed this book for my dad. So in any case, sort of early on, I was, very involved in kind of child welfare, and that really, for me, resonated, maybe somewhat because of my own experience, having dealt with trauma. Some of the kids had, dealt with a lot of trauma. So for me, that was an important entry point, kind of into the community.
Yeah, so you recognized how important advocacy is, or to have an advocate, someone to stick up for you or to defend your rights. And then also, it sounds like, to mentor or to support someone who was facing challenges in their lives.
Sure.
And so how did that then play out, for example, at Occidental?
I had a lot of interesting experiences at Oxy. I remember visiting Soledad Prison when I was at Oxy. I remember going to, I was studying juvenile justice. I went to a lot of juvenile facilities. Ultimately, I took a semester when I was at Oxy, where I worked it was Oxy in Washington, D.C., and I worked for the Public Defender Service in D.C. They had me assigned to a juvenile jail, and I was doing investigations on juvenile justice matters. So I felt like it sort of thrust me into sort of big time, justice issues kind of at an early stage in my life. And I really thrived and enjoyed it. It really, initially when I was at Oxy, I was sort of trying to figure out where I was going to go. But for me, that kind of gave me purpose and maybe connected a little bit with my own life story and maybe my family story a little bit. So
Yeah. You brought a photograph of you advocating. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. This is a photo of me in the 80s on the cover of the Occidental magazine, which was, we were protesting the school's investment in apartheid. And
South Africa.
In South Africa. And then when I finished, as I finished Oxy, I went and I lived in Zimbabwe. And so I was working kind of in a mini Peace Corps program with no running water, no electricity, and very close to South Africa. And I remember wearing like free
Nelson Mandela.
Yeah, T-shirts in Zimbabwe, and I was very close. And at that time, apartheid existed, so I was very close to South Africa. So it made it very real. Later, here I was protesting at Oxy, but later I was right in that region, So.
Yeah, and you continued that role of defender, of advocate. In your work with First 5 LA, and now, of course, in your work with the Department of Mental Health for LA County.
Department of Public Health.
Or Public Health. Thank
Yes.
you for correcting me. Do you want to describe at all what you were doing in those positions?
I think, I'd be remiss not to sort of talk about, at one point in my career, I was director of a transition age youth center here in Pasadena. And it was on the corner of Hill and Orange Grove. And so basically, it was a place where youth that were transitioning out of care could get support services. And I was the director of that program.
I know exactly where that is.
Right. So I did that. I ran that program, but I had many former foster youth who were kind of working alongside me to kind of deliver services to youth in the community. From there, I went on to First 5, and First 5 is, I don't know how much people know about it, but it's a tobacco tax that was, the voters voted in to support early childhood. And so I had a variety of roles, at First 5, but I think you and I were working together on, in my later stages at First 5, I was doing a lot of work with cities and trying to get cities to adopt early childhood policies. So I was working with the city of Pasadena. I was assigned to Pasadena and trying to work with the city to sort of help them maybe think through early childhood policy in this city. So, there's a lot more, I was at First 5 for a number of years, so there's a lot of chapters there, but I won't go into all of those.
Yeah. No, I think it's a fascinating history, and you certainly have made a significant impact both here in Pasadena, but more broadly around LA.
And then I'll just say that, now I work for the Department of Public Health in the substance abuse prevention section. So what I do there is I analyze legislation for mainly at the state level that might impact, around fentanyl, around cannabis, around, harm reduction kinds of issues, and a whole host of issues, alcohol, and how that may impact LA County as a whole. So that's my role now with the Department of Public Health. I work for the substance abuse. It's called SAPC, Substance Abuse Prevention and Control Organization.
That's terrific. Thank you for doing that work. Just to transition into one of the areas that we really want to focus on today is how did your grandfather's story kind of impact your decision making? I mean, obviously, attending a school like Occidental, you could go into being an entrepreneur, you could go into private corporate work, you could, as opposed to in the public sector where you've dedicated most of your energies. Was there anything about your grandfather's story that inspired you to want to be in a more community-oriented or public-serving type of a career?
Yes, I mean, sure, but I will say that some of his story and his wife Cornelia Reed, you know, I view them as a team. So I view their story sort of together. There are differences; they had their own chapters, but anyway, there was some of their story that was. There's a book that I brought with me that my dad wrote called The Diary of a Contraband, which I guess we can get into later. But anyway, this was published in 2002. So there was a lot of research that was going on. My dad was leading a lot of research around sort of developing some of the story in the 80s, the 90s. So while I was at Oxy, some of that research had not yet happened. So I wasn't familiar with all of the story. I was aware of some of it, but not necessarily all of it. And I think, even now there's still more things that are coming out, sort of trickling at times, about the story. But a lot of it, my dad did a fabulous job of capturing, kind of some of the essentials in his book, Diary of a Contraband.
Yeah. So let's go into it. Who was your great-great-grandfather? And what, maybe briefly describe his life. And then we'll talk about the book more specifically.
So my great-great-grandfather's William Gould, so I have his same, William Benjamin Gould, I have his same name. I'm William Benjamin Gould V. This was William Benjamin Gould. So he was a man that lived in Wilmington, North Carolina. Unfortunately, he was enslaved. But at about the age of 24, he and 7 other men were able to escape from enslavement. And they rode down at night, down the Cape Fear River, like 28 miles just at night. They come out into the Atlantic Ocean, and they get picked up by some Navy ships. And so the Navy...
So U.S. naval ships.
Right. And so the Navy enlists them into the Civil War, these men. And so...
And was that, I mean, this may be minutia, but was that automatic when slaves were identified and then collected, I guess you would say? Were they automatically conscripted into the military generally?
I don't know if it was automatic, but I know that, there was, I think, 17,000 black people that fought in the Civil War, so many of which came out of states that were enslaved, where there were enslaved people. So, my great-great-grandfather refers to this as the holiest of all causes. So I feel like he viewed this as a war of equality and freedom.
Liberty.
Yeah, and so I think, I can only imagine that other people might have had the similar sentiments, going into that. So, but I don't know if everybody took the Navy up on their opportunities for, serving in the service.
Yeah.
So
more research, we can do that later. So then what happened once he's enrolled in the Navy? What was his experience?
Well, he ended up serving for 3 years in the Navy. He was on 2 ships. He was on a ship called the USS Cambridge and also on a ship called the USS Niagara. So he had two experiences. Early in his Navy experience, he was somewhat local in the United States. On the second ship, that took him abroad. So he ended up, later in his diary, he's writing entries from places like Portugal, from Ireland, from Spain. So he's actually traveling to go after Confederate ships that were coming out of Europe.
So to track them
down and try to capture them or shoot them down.
Yeah, and prevent them from attacking Union.
Right. So that's
US
one
Army.
thing I think that's not well known about the Civil War is that some of the European nations were helping to build the Confederate ships, and so they were tracking them down to the origin spots for where those ships were coming out of, and so that had him sort of, here's a man coming out of enslavement. All of a sudden, he's there are entries where he's in Lisbon, Portugal, and later on in his experience, but. Early on, he was kind of local. There was a period where he was sick. He got sick for 6 months, and he doesn't have entries in the diary. So what's interesting about
So there's a gap?
There is a gap where there's 6 months of no entries. But my dad worked with this historian named John Hope Franklin, who was famous African-American historian, and my dad is a professor at Stanford. John Hope Franklin came to Stanford, worked with my dad on this. According to him, this is one of only 3 known diaries that were ever kept by people that were enslaved and then enlisted in the Navy. So, but I'm pretty sure it's the most substantial diary, so it pretty much has daily entries for 2.5 of the 3 years that he served, and so he's writing, sort of regular things that are happening to him, as well as later on in his experience, kind of some of the battles that they fought, and some of his experiences,
Yeah, let's explore a little bit. Education for slaves was probably limited. So what in your great-grandfather's experience enabled him to be so capable as a writer, and then to have the desire to want to capture it within the context of a diary?
Well, so Wilmington, North Carolina is an interesting area. Tulsa, Oklahoma has gotten a lot of attention in recent years.
Yeah, of course.
Wilmington is kind of like that. There was a lot of black prosperity going on in Wilmington, a lot of studies of high literacy rates. Of course, it was illegal to learn how to read and write, but I kind of want to refer to Wilmington as kind of a black Mecca that, very similar but earlier in history than Tulsa, very similar history of prosperity for black people post the Civil War. And so my great-great-grandfather comes out of that community. I mean, he was enslaved, so that was obviously a very difficult experience. We don't know a ton about his life prior to his escape. We know that he was enslaved. One of the experiences we know that he was enslaved by Nicholas Nixon, who was a peanut farmer and had a peanut farm plantation. We also know that he worked on a mansion as a plasterer. It was an antebellum mansion called the Bellamy Mansion, and so we know that he was working there at a point in time before his escape. But we don't have any pictures of him when he was in his 20s. We don't, there's no diary entries. So really, in some ways, his life comes alive for us once the diary starts.
So there isn't a documentation of how he learned to read and write?
No, we don't know how he learned to. We know that some of the churches were involved in that with, I think there were several different faiths that were doing work with black folks. I was involved in Pasadena. There was an event for a woman that was Ellen Garrison Clark, who was very prominent in the South of teaching people how to read and write, a black woman. And I told the LA Times, I said, I sort of had a dream that maybe someone like her or someone like her was somebody that trained my great-great-grandfather how to read and write. Of course, some of it is self-taught, but some of it, somebody was helping him. I don't know any of those facts. It's sort of, a dream in my head of
Yeah.
we don't know exactly what the details were.
Since you're very familiar with the diary, are there any incidents or facts that you want to share from the diary, and maybe in particular around relations with the white soldiers as opposed to black soldiers? Are there any references to those relationships?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of factual accounting, that here's what I did today, here's what I ate, kind of like sort of very sort of personal day-to-day kinds of things. My great-great-grandfather was involved in an abolitionist newspaper. So he was writing for this abolitionist newspaper called the Anglo-African out of New York City, and so he wrote some pieces for that abolitionist newspaper. And at times he's meeting with people that are part of the abolitionist movement, and he sort of references them. And I think that's a big part of my dad's research, and some of the people that helped him was trying to figure out who are all these people that he's meeting with, like who are these folks, and started trying to piece together sort of a little bit of a detective story, kind of what's going on, here. But I think, it is to me very interesting that he was part of this abolitionist movement. He meets at one point with a guy named, the NPR this past year did this big series. I encourage everybody to check it out. It's on this guy named Abraham Galloway. And he's somebody that met with President Lincoln on behalf of black folks. My great-great-grandfather's meeting with this guy, Abraham Galloway. And he references, there's a few references to meeting, but there's some of the things, they're sort of just like name drop, met with somebody here. You don't know all the details because it's just really the diary where we're getting our information of, and another piece of the diary I would say that's kind of interesting is we know that he corresponded mainly with two people. His wife-to-be, Cornelia Reed, and his nephew, this guy named George Mapson. Those were the two biggest people that he was sending letters to. So, at some points there's a great line in the diary where he says, "Oh, Cornelia, why do you not write?" And so he's waiting for a letter from Cornelia. But we know that they exchanged something like 64 letters back and forth.
And had those survived as well?
We don't have copies of those letters,
Okay.
but there's references to the letters.
Yeah, you were able to count how many. Yeah.
Yeah. So they always say for Black history, lost, stolen, and strayed. And so I think, having a diary that helps preserve some history in a time where many Black people unfortunately became nameless, I think is a tremendous blessing for our family and for just for history, to be able to have that kind of document, because a lot of history is lost, unfortunately.
Yeah. So your great-great-grandfather's life continues after the Civil War. He doesn't continue writing a diary, but he's engaged in, he's a very successful individual. So could we talk for a few minutes about his life after the Civil War and what he's engaged in and kind of the legacy that he's creating?
Yeah, so William Gould, he gets out of the Navy in 1865 and he says paid, it was something like $12, for his 3-year service.
3 years of service?
Yeah, and he sort of his last lines in the diary, and then from there he enters into Massachusetts. So he goes to Nantucket, where my great-great-grandmother has been. She was purchased out of enslavement, and she has a very interesting story because the church organized this whole campaign they knew that she was up for sale, and they organized
A fundraiser?
a fundraiser through the church, and they even sent, things to England. But the pastor, the pastor, black pastor, had organized this effort, and so she was waiting there in Nantucket. So my great-great-grandfather ultimately moves to Nantucket. They get married there, and the First AME Church, in Nantucket, very small, small church, and they then from there they move around a little bit in Massachusetts. They move to Taunton. They move to some other communities, but ultimately he settles in Dedham, which is a city that's borders. He's basically on the border of Boston. It's just sort of like where they lived was a block outside of Boston, and so that's where he and his family ultimately settle, sort of for the long term after moving around a little bit.
Yeah, and so recently, and unfortunately, we're coming to the close of our conversation.
Okay, sounds good.
We need to have part two. But recently he's been recognized by the city of Denham in a variety of ways. Can you describe what those are and what the recognitions are for?
Yeah, so they've built a park. They've named a park in Dedham 2.5 years ago in his name, and then this past Memorial Day they constructed a statue, and they put a statue of William B. Gould in the park. So it was wonderful experience both for the naming of the park and then to see the statue go in. And we need a whole lot more statues of black figures in this country. We need to take down these statues that are celebrating people like Jefferson Davis and other Confederate folks who were definitely, for me, in the wrong side of history. And we need to celebrate, my great-great-grandfather, but many other black people who were, we don't know enough about their stories.
So why was he recognized in Denham? It wasn't for
he was a founder of an Episcopal. He was a founding member of an Episcopal church in Dedham. He was a construction. He had a construction company, so he helped build one of the biggest churches. It's a Catholic church. The Red Sox radio announcer, his daughter got married in that Catholic church. So my great-great-grandfather was involved in building that church. So he was very involved in, they call it the GAR, the Grand, what is that? The Grand Army. So it's sort of a military veterans group that celebrated black contributions to the military. So he's very involved, and there were a number of pictures of him pretty solid pictures. There was a picture in the in the NAACP magazine called The Crisis, I believe in something like 1917. So there's this great photo of he and his sons who all served in the U.S. military. So,
and just one final question to wrap up.
Okay.
What do you think people should know about his legacy or his impact? What is significant about his life that we should pay attention to?
Well, I often think for myself, here's a man who was enslaved and then, learned how to read and write, was able to then travel to these places. I don't think he was expecting to maybe travel to all these places, but, he's really able to make a life for himself, have, a number of children. My grandfather ultimately, couldn't, my grandfather's a black man, couldn't buy a house because of race. But ultimately my grandfather, now Worcester Polytech, where my grandfather went, they have now dedicated a wing of the school there in his honor. So his family descendants continue to live on, and I'm very proud of some of my dad's accomplishments. My dad represented black musicians. and steel workers in Pittsburgh, and won some class action suits for employment discrimination for them. My dad's first book was Black Workers in White Unions. So I think, but these ancestors of these come from his original bold move of escaping from enslavement, learning how to read and write, and creating a life for himself. And we know that there are many other stories just like his that
Right.
many people that we just don't know the specifics and the names. But for me, it's a really important thing that we learn to celebrate Black history and celebrate those that have been forgotten.
Well, thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your great-great-grandfather's story with us.
Sure.
Thank you for joining us on The Power of One. We can be found on the Arroyo channel and YouTube, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.